All right, so when we talk about mainline Protestantism, what we're talking about are the large, mostly liberal or left-leaning Protestant churches. So who do we mean by that? One of the big ones would be the United Church of Christ. The people who actually ran the school where I went as an undergraduate. I went to Lincoln College, it was a UCC school. United Methodist Church. The fourth largest religious body in the United States. United Methodist Church. Presbyterian Church. USA. Episcopal Church. USA. The American Baptists. Which really means the Northern Baptists. The Northern, largely white Baptists. As opposed to the National Baptist Convention, which is a largely African-American denomination. There's several others that we can place in here as well. But what do all these churches have in common with each other? Your book gives this, well, we should also put disciples of Christ. Your book gives you all these characters, or rather characteristics, of mainline Protestantism. And some of these are more important than others. Like, theology reflected in preaching strongly influenced by the liberal, social gospel, and neo-orthodox movements. Inclusivity with regard to theological, social, and political opinions. Having an often complex denominational structure. Reliance on interdenominational divinity schools. Receptiveness to ecumenical activity. Involvement in a lot of social issues. Some examples of this in the last few elections, United Methodist Church played a pretty important role. They actually took a pretty strong stand against the Iraq War, against the presidency of George Bush. United Church of Christ was even further to the left of them. And all these churches fit within the Protestant spectrum. And many of them came about as a result of mergers of people, this ecumenical movement, especially the evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So, what's actually characteristic of these? Like your book says, the 1960s was a major turning point for quite a few of these denominations. Up until the 1960s, a lot of these, with the exception of the United Church of Christ, were actually growing. A lot of times people think of America in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s as conservative. But the conservatives were actually in the decline during those periods. America as a country was, sort of broadly liberal. And conservatives were around, but they were mostly seen as being on the fringes, as not having a role in political life and intellectual life. Liberals dominated American political and intellectual life, really until after the 1960s. These churches were closely connected with this. These churches sort of reflected that. So they grew in a period where that was where the culture was. United Church of Christ is the exception. As soon as they actually came together, they immediately started hemorrhaging membership, and they've never actually managed to turn the tide. They have less members now than they did when they first came together back in the 1940s, believe it or not. But the rest of these, up until the 60s, were doing okay. And a lot of things shook them up. what do you associate the 60s with, besides sex, drugs, rock and roll, and the Vietnam War? The Vietnam War played a role in this, but what else?
Civil rights.
Yeah, civil rights is a major thing, and that had to do with what? Civil rights for who originally?
Minorities.
Yeah, originally it had to do with African Americans in the South, and then you get other sort of waves coming in. Women with the feminist movement saying, hey, what about us? What are some of the other groups that have swung into that broad civil rights current after the African Americans, Latinos, feminists? Who else? What are the main discussions about civil rights today in terms of? Who's saying that their civil rights are usually, routinely in many states, still not respected?
Can you redefine the question?
What are we playing, Jeopardy? Yeah. What?
Is it gay and lesbian?
Yeah. And the acronym changes and gets longer and longer and longer. Facebook now has something like 50 different gender options. Bless you. Because people keep redefining themselves, and every time they do, that's got to be respected as well, and that's got to be respected as well. And that's been something that's divided the culture and the country. So, as a matter of fact, some of the older civil rights people don't like the fact that it seems like just about anybody who wants to use the term civil rights will take it on and talk about discrimination all being the same. But that's a whole different can of worms. These are all things that affected these mainline denominations. It wasn't so much in terms of gay marriage. There's been a recent debate here in the States in the 1960s. It's really been more about female ordination, whether women could become priests, bishops, ministers, and then later on after that, gay ordination. More in the 80s, that became an issue. So there were other questions too about how these churches ought to respond to the civil rights struggle. Should they be, supporting those fighting for civil rights in the South? Should they be supporting the feminist movement? Should they be, and I guess with the feminist movement, which feminist movement are you going to support? Because, there's first generation, second generation, or sometimes they talk in terms of waves. It gets very tricky, very complicated. So a lot of these churches found themselves taking a more leftward turn in the 1960s. But the leftward turn, think of them as being sort of like big boats. How many of you ever had to be on a big boat, like a ferry or something like that before? A few of you? Is it easy to turn those things around? Not much. What if you go to the ferry person and say, I think I left my keys in my car. Can you take me back? They're going to say, well, that's not possible. We don't have the room to do that. It's easy to turn the rudder. The people who are in control can turn the rudder, but it may take a long time for the big boat itself to actually start moving in a different direction. And in any organization, you've got the people who are in charge. In a religious organization, who's that going to be, usually? The hierarchy, the ministers, the trustees, people like that. And then you've got the laity. And so in some of these churches, the people in charge, also in the seminaries, where they're training the new ministers, they would be a lot more liberal than the laity. And so that led to some rifts occurring in these churches. Like it says, in the 1970s, discontent among the rank-and-file occupiers of local pews began to manifest itself in a lot of different ways. Pressure from the grassroots to slow down or halt the rapid changes of the previous decade began to be felt, and most dramatically, membership began to decline. All these churches have another thing in common. They're all losing membership, and they've all been losing membership for quite some time. As they lose membership, the demographics tend to skew age-wise upward. They're having less and less children, and the people in the pews, they call it the graying of the pews. Meaning you look out and you see not only less people in the church, but mostly gray hair if you go into many of these churches. A sign of a vital church is that you have a lot of young people. Because if you don't manage to draw in young people, then what's going to happen 20 years, 30 years, 40 years from now? Now, where did the young people go? Well, part of the issue was in America and in the West in general, birth rates have been declining. Everyone knows that, right? Think about your grandparents. How many kids were in your grandparents' families? How many brothers and sisters they have compared to how many brothers and sisters you have? Probably more, right? Mm-hmm. My grandfather came from a family of 13 kids who survived. That's not counting the ones who died in the influenza epidemic or stuff like that. A lot of those kids went on to have 4, 5, 6 kids of their own. By the time you get down to my level, it's about 2. And many are not even doing that. So there's that, but where else did the kids go? Where else did the younger people go? In part, they got attracted to more conservative churches, but many of them just became very secular and sort of dropped out of the religious landscape altogether. So like it says, on the one side, evangelical, Pentecostal, other conservative churches began to experience extremely high growth rates, drawing in part on alienated mainliners for recruits and enjoying a high birth rate among their membership. Now, why would the conservative churches have a high birth rate? Yeah.
A lot of these churches encourage their members to have children.
That's part of it, be fruitful and multiply. What do you think the other key factor would be? There are really 2 key factors. What are, when it comes to sexuality, what is something that, besides abstinence, that conservatives often will take a stand on? Yeah.
Get very young and have children.
Well, we already got that part. So, everybody wants to have sex, because we all have a desire for that. But
could it be like abortion? Maybe?
That's a big one. That's not to say that conservatives never have abortions, because that's not true. But the rate is much lower than in churches that actually, support, and sometimes, will have that in their platforms, abortion. Yeah.
I was just going to say like contraception use.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's abortion is a key issue. Whether you use contraceptives or not. And that kind of goes, you can't be fruitful and multiply if you're using contraceptives, right? So the conservative churches tend to have a higher birth rate, a greater demographic. The same thing's happening in Judaism, by the way. Reform Judaism, much lower birth rate than Hasidic Judaism or Orthodox Judaism. So that's one part of the picture. Then your book also talks about mainline socialization of the young had not proven strong enough to resist the pull of secularity or the attraction of a do-it-self spiritual life offered by the New Age. So when we're talking about the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, these churches didn't manage to hold on to many of the young people. As a matter of fact, if you're not used to hearing about these churches, even though they litter the landscape around you, it's probably because they haven't been seen as relevant to you. So, and then your book talks about a number of different examples of how this has panned out. And I'm actually going to skip over all these, denominational connections, how the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America came together, and the story of the Seminects, how the Presbyterians came together, the Anglican communion breaking up, more or less, in recent years over questions of gay ordination. What I really want to focus on is something that they're talking about in the very end of this section. Here we go. So it says, this is the panorama of the Mainline, whose fortunes have tended to wane and wax together. For many, the causes of their decline lay not only in the competition offered by the evangelical churches and secularism on the other hand, but what was perceived as a lack of spiritual vitality. These churches were not able to come across, even though they've actually, some of them, like United Church of Christ and United Methodist Church, have spent quite a lot of money on trying to reach young people. They've not been able to convince people that there's really something going on there that's going to draw them in, that's going to give them a sense of the sacred, of the spiritual. The other problem, like your book points out, is a proliferation of bureaucratic structures and special purpose organizations. That's hard for people to relate to as well. And then it talks about a continuing unrest among the grassroots of the appropriateness of the identification at the national level of several of these denominations with liberal positions on public issues. There's one other thing that the book points out as well. These churches are about overcoming, say, segregation, overcoming racial differentiation. So, like it says, in theory, issues of racial and sexual equality had been resolved. Conscious discrimination against women or racial minorities had become unthinkable. In practice, the small numbers of minorities in these churches, and the fact that women clergy have difficulty in being called to the larger churches, show that these churches really haven't effectively overcome those issues. So that's where we'll leave off. These churches are going to be around the rest of your life. But unless the tide changes, they're going to continue to lose membership, and they're going to continue to decline in importance. Except politically. This is what we call the religious left in America, or at least a component of the religious left, which is something as committed and as involved as the religious right. Which is what we'll look at now.